The first report about the camera arrived as a routine technical complaint. Nothing about it seemed unusual at the time. The security office of an aging municipal building had submitted a maintenance request stating that one of their CCTV cameras was malfunctioning during the night shift. According to the technician notes, the camera positioned in the lower basement corridor was capturing unidentifiable visual distortions between the hours of 2:00 a.m. and 3 a.m. At first, the issue was treated like any other hardware glitch. Cameras sometimes developed interference when cables degraded or when nearby electrical systems created signal noise. The building itself was old enough to justify that explanation. Built decades earlier, it had undergone several renovations, leaving behind a maze of outdated wiring running through the walls and ceilings. Most technicians assumed the camera was simply reacting to aging infrastructure. But when the maintenance team reviewed the recorded footage, the problem no longer looked like a technical failure. The video feed showed the corridor exactly as it should appear: dim fluorescent lights, concrete walls, a long stretch of empty hallway leading to a locked storage door at the far end. Everything appeared normal for nearly an hour of recording. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., something changed. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., something changed. At first it looked like a flicker in the lighting, an almost invisible shift in brightness that lasted less than half a second. The kind of fluctuation that might happen if electricity briefly dipped in the circuit. But when the technicians slowed the footage frame by frame, they noticed a shape appearing in the darkness near the far wall. It wasn't clear enough to identify as a person. It didn't even move like one. The shape simply existed for a single frame before vanishing again. The shape simply existed for a single frame before vanishing again. Most people reviewing the footage assumed it was compression noise from the digital recording system. Security cameras often produce strange artifacts when recording in low light. But what happened next made that explanation difficult to accept. Exactly 30 seconds later, the shape appeared again. This time it remained visible for 3 frames, just long enough to notice its outline. It was tall, much taller than an average person. It was tall, much taller than an average person. And it seemed to be standing in a section of the hallway where no one could physically stand. The area was partially blocked by a steel support beam attached to the wall. Yet the figure appeared to be occupying the same space as the beam itself. Almost as if the two objects existed in the same place simultaneously. When the technicians replayed the footage several more times, they noticed something else, even stranger. The camera had not detected motion. Normally, if a person entered the hallway, the system would flag the recording automatically because its software tracked movement within the frame. The system would flag the recording automatically because its software tracked movement within the frame. But during the exact moments when the shape appeared, the system showed no motion alerts at all. As far as the camera's software was concerned, nothing had entered the hallway. The figure existed on the recording without triggering the system designed to detect it. That was the moment the building's security supervisor decided to check the footage from the other cameras positioned nearby. If someone had entered the corridor, they would have appeared on at least one of the adjacent cameras before reaching the basement hallway. But none of the other feeds showed any activity during the same time period. No footsteps, no shadows, no door opening, nothing. The hallway camera was the only device that captured the strange figure. The hallway camera was the only device that captured the strange figure. Over the next several nights, the maintenance team continued monitoring the feed to see if the problem repeated itself. At first, nothing unusual appeared. The hallway remained empty exactly as it should. But on the 4th night, the distortion returned. Once again it happened shortly after 2:00 a.m. This time the figure appeared closer to the camera. It still did not move. It did not walk or shift position the way a person would. Instead, it appeared in one frame, disappeared, and then appeared again several feet closer in the next moment of footage. The pattern continued across the recording. Each time the shape appeared, It was slightly closer to the camera lens. Frame by frame, it seemed to move forward without ever actually being seen walking. The technicians reviewing the footage felt an increasing sense of unease as the sequence continued. Something about the movement was wrong. Human motion doesn't occur in sudden jumps like that. Human motion doesn't occur in sudden jumps like that. Even if someone moved quickly through the corridor, the camera would capture intermediate frames showing the transition from one position to another. But this figure didn't follow those rules. It simply skipped distance, appearing closer and closer each time the image refreshed. By the final frame where the shape appeared, it had reached the center of the hallway. That was the moment the distortion became clear enough to examine. The figure looked almost human, but not completely. Its limbs were longer than normal, hanging downward at unnatural angles. Its head seemed tilted slightly to one side, as though observing the camera from a curious angle. And the most disturbing detail was the absence of any visible face. The area where facial features should have been appeared blurred, like a smudge across the recording. Seconds later, the footage returned to normal. The hallway was empty again. When the technicians replayed the video one last time, they noticed something none of them had seen before. In the final frame where the figure appeared closest to the camera, its head seemed angled directly toward the lens, almost as if it had been watching whoever would eventually review the footage. That was the first moment anyone suggested the camera might not simply be malfunctioning, because whatever the device had recorded had never entered the building through any door, and according to every other camera in the security system, it had never been there at all. Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine while watching a seemingly ordinary security video? What if I told you some footage is so unsettling, it demands a closer look? This story starts with a grainy clip, a tall, shadowy figure caught on a security camera in a quiet office building. The supervisors were skeptical, thinking it was just a glitch or a clever prank. But to be sure, they sent it to a digital forensics expert. The verdict came back, and it sent a shiver through everyone. The footage was 100% authentic. No tampering, no digital manipulation. That's when things started to get really strange. What if I told you some footage is so unsettling, it demands a closer look? This story starts with a grainy clip, a tall, shadowy figure caught on a security camera in a quiet office building. The supervisors were skeptical, thinking it was just a glitch or a clever prank. But to be sure, they sent it to a digital forensics expert. The verdict came back, and it sent a shiver through everyone. The footage was 100% authentic. No tampering, no digital manipulation. That's when things started to get really strange. It wasn't just that one camera anymore. Soon, other cameras throughout the building began capturing oddities. Fleeting shadows would dart across empty hallways. Faint, disembodied whispers were picked up by the audio sensors, muttering just on the edge of hearing. The atmosphere in the building grew heavy, and an undeniable sense of unease settled over the staff, especially the night shift. The supervisors, now genuinely concerned, decided they needed to dig deeper. They started pulling old city records, trying to find anything unusual about the property's history. Fleeting shadows would dart across empty hallways. Faint, disembodied whispers were picked up by the audio sensors, muttering just on the edge of hearing. The atmosphere in the building grew heavy, and an undeniable sense of unease settled over the staff, especially the night shift. The supervisors, now genuinely concerned, decided they needed to dig deeper. They started pulling old city records, trying to find anything unusual about the property's history. And that's when they found it. The modern office building stood on the exact site of a 19th century workhouse, a place of immense suffering and despair. And this workhouse had a dark secret. It had burned to the ground in a catastrophic fire decades ago. The old newspaper clippings told a tragic story. Dozens of people had perished in the blaze. The official report placed the blame squarely on one man, the night watchman. He was described as a tall man who had allegedly fallen asleep on duty, a fatal act of negligence that cost him his own life and the lives of many others. And this workhouse had a dark secret. It had burned to the ground in a catastrophic fire decades ago. The old newspaper clippings told a tragic story. Dozens of people had perished in the blaze. The official report placed the blame squarely on one man, the night watchman. He was described as a tall man who had allegedly fallen asleep on duty, a fatal act of negligence that cost him his own life and the lives of many others. Just as this horrifying history came to light, the entity in the building became bolder. The tall, shadowy figure was captured on camera again, in the same hallway as before, but this time was different. As the security team watched the monitor, frozen in disbelief, the figure slowly, deliberately, turned its head towards the camera lens, as if it knew it was being watched. The grainy silhouette now had a focus, an awareness that was utterly terrifying. This wasn't just a residual echo. It felt like an intelligence was observing them back. The line between the past and the present was blurring. The tall, shadowy figure was captured on camera again, in the same hallway as before, but this time was different. As the security team watched the monitor, frozen in disbelief, the figure slowly, deliberately, turned its head towards the camera lens, as if it knew it was being watched. The grainy silhouette now had a focus, an awareness that was utterly terrifying. This wasn't just a residual echo. It felt like an intelligence was observing them back. The line between the past and the present was blurring. The digital world then crashed into physical reality. One night, a security guard doing his rounds saw it with his own eyes. Not on a screen, but right there in the corridor ahead of him. A towering, distorted shadow that seemed to suck the light out of the air around it. It was a grotesque parody of a human form, and it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving the guard pale and shaking. He quit the next day, refusing to ever set foot in that building again. The haunting had reached its terrifying climax. One night, a security guard doing his rounds saw it with his own eyes, not on a screen, but right there in the corridor ahead of him. A towering, distorted shadow that seemed to suck the light out of the air around it. It was a grotesque parody of a human form, and it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving the guard pale and shaking. He quit the next day, refusing to ever set foot in that building again. The haunting had reached its terrifying climax. The final event was the most direct and horrifying of all. The entity appeared one last time, but not in the distance. It manifested directly in front of the main security camera. The tall figure filled the entire frame, its features still indistinct except for one chilling detail: a gaping, screaming mouth, a silent, eternal cry of agony and rage. The image burned onto the screen for a single, terrifying second before the entire security system crashed. All screens went black. When the system was finally rebooted, the footage was gone, wiped clean, as if the spirit had delivered its final, furious message and then erased itself from the record. What do you think happened? Was it the vengeful spirit of the wronged night watchman, trying to clear his name? Let me know your theories in the comments. Thanks for watching. The entity appeared one last time, but not in the distance. It manifested directly in front of the main security camera. The tall figure filled the entire frame, its features still indistinct, except for one chilling detail: a gaping, screaming mouth, a silent, eternal cry of agony and rage. The image burned onto the screen for a single, terrifying second before the entire security system crashed. All screens went black. When the system was finally rebooted, the footage was gone, wiped clean, as if the spirit had delivered its final, furious message and then erased itself from the record. What do you think happened? Was it the vengeful spirit of the wronged night watchman, trying to clear his name? Let me know your theories in the comments. Thanks for watching. After the first recordings were discovered, the security supervisor assumed the issue would eventually be traced back to faulty hardware. Cameras break, digital systems glitch. In buildings as old as the one housing the basement corridor, strange technical problems were almost expected. But what made this situation different was how consistent the anomaly became. Over the next 6 nights, the same camera captured the same event again and again. Each time it happened within the same window of time, somewhere between 2:13 and 2:21 in the morning. Each time the hallway appeared empty until the flicker of interference briefly passed across the frame. And each time, hidden inside that flicker, the same tall figure appeared for only a few frames before disappearing again. By the seventh night, the technicians had stopped treating the recordings as a simple malfunction. Instead, they began documenting every appearance of the figure as if they were tracking a pattern. The recordings revealed something unsettling. The figure was getting closer to the camera each time it appeared, not within a single video but across multiple nights. On the first recording, it had appeared near the far end of the corridor beside the steel support beam. 2 nights later, it appeared several feet farther forward. By the 6th recording, it had reached the middle of the hallway, and by the 7th, it stood less than 10 feet away from the camera lens. When investigators later reviewed the footage in sequence, the progression looked almost deliberate, as though something had been slowly approaching the camera over several nights, but could only move forward in small, broken steps between frames. The building management decided to send a security guard to physically check the basement corridor the next night while the camera was recording. The idea was simple. If the anomaly appeared again, the guard would be present to confirm whether anyone nor anything was actually standing there. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the guard radioed the security office confirming he had reached the basement hallway. The camera showed him clearly entering the frame and walking toward the center of the corridor. He stood beneath the fluorescent lights for several minutes, shining his flashlight down the length of the empty passageway. The hallway looked exactly the way it always had, silent, still, completely empty. Nothing stood near the steel beam. Nothing stood in the shadows along the wall. When the guard confirmed there was nothing unusual in the area, the supervisor instructed him to remain there until 2:20 a.m., the moment when the figure usually appeared on the recordings. What happened next is what transformed a minor technical investigation into something far more disturbing. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the familiar flicker passed across the camera feed. For less than half a second, the brightness in the video shifted slightly just enough to notice if someone was watching carefully, and in that moment, the figure appeared again, only this time it wasn't standing alone in the hallway. It was standing directly behind the guard. The recording showed the guard facing away from the camera, unaware of anything behind him. But towering over his shoulder was the same tall silhouette captured in previous nights of footage. Its head leaned forward slightly, almost as if observing the guard from only inches away. The figure's elongated arms hung motionless at its sides. Its face remained blurred beyond recognition. The guard did not react. He did not turn around. According to his radio transmission, the hallway remained completely empty. When the flicker ended and the recording returned to normal brightness, the figure vanished again. Only the guard remained in the frame, standing alone beneath the fluorescent lights. When the security team replayed the footage for him later that morning, the guard insisted there had been nothing behind him at any point during his inspection. He said the hallway had been silent the entire time. No footsteps, no movement, no change in the air around him. Yet the recording clearly showed the figure standing directly behind him during the exact moment he claimed the corridor was empty. At first, the technicians assumed the camera had somehow overlaid corrupted data from an earlier recording onto the current footage. But a deeper analysis of the digital file quickly disproved that theory. The image of the figure was embedded directly into the frame sequence of the recording. It wasn't an editing error or a reused image. The system had captured something that existed in that moment, even if no one standing there could see it. As the investigation continued, the technicians began examining footage from the rest of the building's camera network during the same time window. The building contained more than 30 cameras positioned across stairwells, hallways, storage rooms, and entrances. If the anomaly was truly connected to the basement camera alone, then none of the other devices should show anything unusual. But what they discovered instead made the situation far more disturbing. The same flicker appeared briefly in 3 other cameras across the building during the exact same minute. One camera positioned near a stairwell recorded a shadow stretching across the wall for a single frame. Another camera facing a locked supply room captured a dark shape partially blocking the door before disappearing again. And the third camera, located in a hallway 2 floors above the basement, recorded something even more alarming. For just 2 frames, the tall silhouette appeared standing directly in front of the lens, so close that its blurred face filled most of the image. When technicians enhanced the frame and slowed it down, they noticed a detail that made several of them stop watching the footage entirely. The blurred area where the face should have been wasn't random distortion. Beneath the blur, something seemed to be moving. Subtle shapes shifting slowly in the darkness, where the eyes and mouth should exist. As if the camera had captured a face that didn't fully belong inside the visible spectrum of light. That discovery forced the investigation to consider a possibility no one in the security office wanted to acknowledge. The cameras were not malfunctioning. They were capturing something real. Something present inside the building during those early morning hours. Something that could stand behind a living person without being seen, and something that only appeared inside the frames of a recording device. The technicians reviewing the footage reached a chilling conclusion. Whatever the cameras were capturing did not exist in the same way normal objects do. It wasn't moving through the building like a person walking down a hallway. It was moving through the recordings themselves, appearing only in the tiny fraction of time when the camera's sensor captured a frame of digital light, and with each passing night, the pattern suggested the same thing. The figure was getting closer to the cameras, closer to the people watching them. And if the recordings continued the way they had for the past week, the next time it appeared, it might not be standing at the end of a hallway anymore. It might be standing directly in front of the lens, watching whoever was on the other side of the screen. After the discovery that the figure could appear behind people without being seen, the building's security team stopped treating the situation as a routine technical problem. Every recording from the previous 2 weeks was pulled from the archive and analyzed frame by frame. At first, the investigators were only looking for new appearances of the tall silhouette, but what they eventually found was far worse than expected. The figure had been present in the recordings much earlier than anyone realized. In fact, the first appearance dated back nearly 3 months before the technicians ever noticed the anomaly. Hidden within thousands of hours of surveillance footage were brief flickers, single frames, where something stood at the edge of the camera's field of view. At the time, those frames had been dismissed as digital noise, but when investigators enhanced the images and aligned them in chronological order, a pattern emerged. The figure had been appearing in the building's cameras for weeks, slowly moving from one location to another. The earliest frame showed it standing at the far end of a parking garage camera outside the building. The next appearance occurred several days later, inside the lobby security feed. Then it appeared near a stairwell, then the basement hallway. Each time the shape was closer to the center of the building, and each time it appeared for only a fraction of a second, too briefly for anyone watching live to notice. The investigators soon realized something else that made the pattern even more disturbing. The figure did not follow physical pathways through the building. It never appeared walking through doors, hallways, or staircases like a normal person would. Instead, it seemed to move from camera to camera, as though traveling through the surveillance system itself. In one recording, it stood in the lobby. The next time it appeared, days later, on a completely different floor, with no footage showing how it got there. It was as if the cameras themselves were providing a path for the figure to travel. As the technicians continued reviewing footage, they began noticing small changes in the recordings whenever the figure appeared. The digital files containing those frames were slightly corrupted, even though the rest of the video remained perfectly intact. Certain pixels near the figure showed unusual distortion patterns, similar to what happens when data begins degrading during compression. But the distortion only occurred around the silhouette. The rest of the image remained unaffected. The technicians initially believed the corruption was simply caused by the camera struggling to process low light. But one analyst noticed something strange when examining the corrupted pixels closely. The distortion patterns were repeating, not randomly, but in organized shapes that looked almost like symbols. When those shapes were isolated and aligned side by side from multiple recordings, they formed a faint geometric structure embedded in the video noise. It wasn't clear what the structure represented, but it appeared to grow more complex each time the figure appeared in a recording, almost as if the distortion itself was evolving. Meanwhile, the security guard who had unknowingly stood in front of the figure during the hallway incident began reporting unusual experiences during his shifts. At first, he complained of headaches while monitoring the cameras late at night. Then he started noticing brief flickers on the screens that other guards didn't see. According to his report, the flickers appeared only when he was watching the basement corridor camera. One moment the hallway would appear empty. The next moment something seemed to move across the screen too quickly to identify. When he replayed the footage afterward, nothing unusual appeared in the recording. Eventually the guard admitted something else he had been afraid to mention earlier. He believed the figure in the recordings had turned its head during the moment it stood behind him. The other guards dismissed this idea immediately. The video clearly showed the silhouette remaining completely still in every frame where it appeared. But the guard insisted the figure had moved while the footage was being recorded, just not in the final playback. According to him, the thing behind him had tilted its head slightly, as though noticing the camera itself. This claim unsettled the technicians reviewing the recordings, because it suggested something impossible. If the guard had seen movement that didn't appear in the video later, it meant the camera might not be capturing everything that happened during the recording process. In other words, the figure might exist in a space between the frames themselves. That possibility became even more disturbing when the investigators reviewed footage captured the following night. At exactly 2:19 a.m., the basement hallway camera experienced its usual flicker of interference. The frame darkened for less than half a second. When the image returned to normal brightness, the silhouette appeared again, but this time something had changed. The figure was no longer standing in the hallway. It was standing directly in front of the camera lens. Its blurred face filled nearly the entire frame. The elongated outline of its shoulders extended beyond the edges of the recording. For the first time since the anomaly began, the silhouette appeared in consecutive frames instead of disappearing instantly. One frame, then another, then another. The figure remained there for almost a full second before the image returned to normal. When technicians slowed the footage down, they noticed something that caused several members of the security team to leave the room. The blurred area where the figure's face should have been was shifting slightly between frames. Subtle movements rippled beneath the distortion, like shadows sliding beneath fog. But the most disturbing detail appeared in the final frame, before the figure vanished. Within the blurred shape, something faintly resembled a pair of eyes. They were not clear enough to identify as human, but they were positioned exactly where eyes should be, and they were pointed directly at the camera lens, as if the thing inside the recording had finally realized it was being watched. After that night, the building's surveillance system began experiencing new problems. Cameras that had never malfunctioned before started flickering during the early morning hours. Several recordings contained frames where the hallway lights dimmed slightly, even though the electrical systems showed no interruption in power. And occasionally, when the security team checked the live camera feed between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., they would notice something disturbing in the reflection of the monitors themselves. A tall shape standing behind them in the room. When they turned around, nothing was there. But when they looked back at the screens, the flicker would appear again. The investigators eventually realized something they hadn't considered at the beginning of the case. The figure was not simply moving closer to the cameras. It was learning how they worked. Every new recording revealed the silhouette appearing for slightly longer periods of time, slightly clearer, slightly more defined, as though the thing inside the recordings was gradually adapting to the world outside the frame. And if the pattern continued the way it had for the past 3 months, it would only be a matter of time before the figure no longer needed the camera to exist at all. By the 4th week, the security team stopped watching the surveillance system the way they used to. What was once a routine part of their job, monitoring quiet hallways and empty stairwells, had turned into something far more unsettling. Every flicker on the screens made them pause. Every distortion in the recording felt like a warning. The cameras had started capturing something that clearly did not follow the rules of our physical world. The more footage they reviewed, the more it seemed like the thing inside the recordings was changing. The figure that once appeared for only a single frame was now visible long enough to see details that were unseen there before. Its outline was sharper, its height more clearly defined, and the strange blur where its face should have been had started behaving in ways that made the technicians deeply uncomfortable. At first the blur just looked like a smudge in the recording, a patch of visual distortion hiding whatever features should have been there. But in the newest footage, the blur seemed to shift constantly, almost like smoke trapped inside the shape of a human head. Every time investigators paused the video and examined the frames, the shadows inside the blur appeared slightly different. Lines where there had been none before. Darker shapes forming and dissolving in ways that suggested movement. One technician described it as watching a face try to form out of darkness, but never quite succeeding. The most disturbing change, however, was how the figure began interacting with the environment. In earlier recordings, the silhouette simply existed within the frame. It didn't react to anything. It didn't move objects or change the lighting. It just appeared, then vanished. But soon, investigators noticed small disturbances occurring exactly when the figure appeared. Fluorescent lights flickered more violently. Shadows along the walls stretched for a fraction of a second. In one case, a metal storage door at the end of a hallway vibrated briefly, as if something had brushed against it, even though the figure itself never moved. The security supervisor initially thought these were just electrical problems. But when they slowed the recordings down, frame by frame, the timing was impossible to ignore. Every single disturbance happened at the exact moment the silhouette appeared. The cameras weren't just capturing a shape anymore. They were capturing something that was beginning to affect the physical world. The turning point came during a night shift. Two guards were monitoring the live feeds together in the security office. It was just after 2:10 a.m., the same time the figure had appeared before. Both guards were watching the basement corridor feed closely, expecting the usual flicker. For several minutes, nothing. The hallway remained empty. Then the flicker appeared again. But this time, the distortion didn't vanish. The image froze for half a second, just long enough for the shape to form clearly. The tall silhouette stood at the far end of the corridor, its long arms hanging motionless. For the first time, the figure remained visible long enough for the guards to react while watching the live feed. One of them leaned forward, staring at the screen. "What is that?" he whispered. But neither guard noticed what was happening right behind them. The second camera inside the security office, meant to record the room itself, captured something the two men never saw. At the exact moment the figure appeared on the basement camera, the same tall silhouette manifested briefly inside the security office. It appeared directly behind the two guards. The figure was there for only 2 frames before vanishing. But during those frames, the office camera captured a detail that changed everything. The figure's head moved, not a glitch, a deliberate movement. The blurred shape that should have been its face tilted slowly downward, toward the two men watching the monitors, almost as if it were observing them, studying them. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. Meanwhile, the guards were still staring at the basement feed. On their screen, the figure had already disappeared. The case began to take its toll, seeping into the investigators' lives outside of work. Sleep offered no escape. The silence of his own home felt as menacing as the empty hallways on the monitors. Every shadow seemed to hold a familiar, elongated shape, and when sleep finally came, it was worse. It was a canvas for their fears. He would wake, gasping. The image burned into his mind. Paranoia became a constant companion. They were consumed by the mystery, staring into the abyss. The horror was no longer confined to the tapes. Their nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The man in the mirror was a stranger, searching for patterns in the noise, waiting for the sun to rise, and dreading the night to come. Neither of them had noticed a thing inside the room. It wasn't until the next morning, when technicians reviewed the full security archive, that the footage from the office camera was discovered. When they aligned the timestamps, the events became horrifyingly clear. The figure hadn't just appeared on one camera, it had appeared in two places at the same time, inside the recording and outside of it. This forced investigators to confront a possibility no one had considered. The figure wasn't traveling through the cameras. The cameras were acting like windows, brief openings that allow something to cross from another reality into ours. If that theory was correct, the recordings from the past few weeks showed something terrifying. The figure was appearing more frequently, staying visible longer, and interacting with the environment more directly each time. The boundary separating it from our world was getting weaker. The final piece of evidence arrived 3 nights later. At 2:18 a.m., the basement camera flickered. The silhouette appeared again in the center of the corridor. But this time something happened that had never occurred before. The figure raised its arm. Slowly, unnaturally, the elongated limb lifted until it pointed directly toward the camera lens. The movement lasted less than 1/10 of a second, then the recording went back to normal. The hallway was empty again. When investigators replayed the footage, they noticed something even more disturbing. As the arm lifted, the blurred face had turned slightly toward the lens, and the shadows within the distortion had finally formed something recognizable. 2 hollow shapes where eyes should be, both of them staring directly through the camera at whoever would eventually watch the recording. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Stay safe out there. After the moment the figure raised its arm toward the camera, the security team stopped treating the situation as a surveillance issue entirely. The footage had crossed a line no one could easily explain. Cameras were meant to capture reality as it happened, light entering a lens, converting into digital frames, and storing those frames as a record of the physical world. But whatever the basement corridor camera had captured was beginning to behave as though it understood the recording process itself. The silhouette wasn't just appearing randomly anymore. It was responding, reacting, looking directly at the lens as though aware that someone on the other side of the screen would eventually watch the footage. For several days after that recording, the building's security system remained quiet. No flickers, no distortions. Every hallway appeared exactly as it should. The silence might have reassured the staff if the events of the previous weeks hadn't been so carefully documented. Instead, the absence of activity felt worse than the disturbances themselves. It was as if something had suddenly stopped moving, not because it was gone, but because it had already reached the place it wanted to be. The security supervisor decided to keep the basement camera recording continuously during the early morning hours, just in case the anomaly appeared again. Every night the system saved hours of empty hallway footage to the archive. For 3 nights, nothing unusual happened. Then on the 4th night, at exactly 2:16 a.m., the camera flickered again. But this time the disturbance lasted longer than anyone had ever seen before. Instead of a quick flash of interference, the entire frame dimmed for nearly 2 full seconds. When the brightness returned, the silhouette was already standing in the hallway. Not at the far end, not in the middle, directly in front of the camera lens. The elongated shape filled most of the frame, its shoulders stretching beyond the edges of the recording. Its arms hung loosely at its sides, bending at angles that looked slightly too long to belong to a human body. And the blurred space where its face should have been was closer than ever before, so close that the distortion almost seemed to press against the surface of the screen. For the first time since the phenomenon began, the figure did not vanish after a few frames. It remained there, motionless, watching. The recording captured nearly 10 seconds of footage before the image finally flickered again. During those 10 seconds, the hallway behind the silhouette appeared darker than usual, as if the fluorescent lights themselves were struggling to illuminate the space around it. The technicians reviewing the footage later noticed something even stranger about the moment. The silhouette didn't appear to be standing in front of the camera at all. Its shape overlapped the frame in ways that made no physical sense. like a shadow cast from inside the lens, rather than from the hallway itself. But the most disturbing detail became visible when investigators slowed the recording down and examined the frames individually. In the first few frames, the figure appeared completely still. Then, halfway through the 10-second recording, something moved within the blur that formed its face. Slowly, almost carefully, the shadows inside the distortion shifted into a recognizable pattern. The hollow shapes resembling eyes became clearer, and beneath them, a darker opening formed where a mouth might be. The expression looked almost like a smile. The final frame before the distortion ended revealed something no one in the investigation team could explain. The silhouette leaned forward slightly, not toward the hallway, toward the camera itself, as though trying to move closer to whoever might eventually be watching the footage. After that moment, the recording returned to normal. The hallway was empty again. The fluorescent lights flickered back to their usual brightness. No further distortions appeared that night. When the security team reviewed the footage the next morning, they expected to find the same pattern as before: one short recording containing the anomaly, followed by hours of normal video. But the archive contained something else entirely. The recording file from 2:16 a.m. had not stopped. Instead of 10 seconds of distorted footage, the system had stored nearly 40 minutes of continuous recording. The hallway remained empty for the entire duration, but at the very end of the file, just before the recording stopped, something appeared in the reflection of the camera lens itself. A tall silhouette standing behind the camera, not in the hallway, on the opposite side of the lens. The technicians analyzing the video initially believed the reflection must have been caused by a person standing in front of the monitor while reviewing the footage. But the timestamp showed the reflection appearing long before anyone opened the file that morning. According to the system logs, the recording had captured the silhouette in real time while the hallway remained completely empty. In other words, the figure had not been standing inside the corridor anymore. It had moved somewhere else, somewhere outside the frame of the camera. Investigators shut down the basement surveillance system immediately after discovering the reflection. The camera was removed from the ceiling and examined for signs of damage or tampering, but nothing unusual was found inside the device. The wiring was intact, the sensor was functioning normally, and no evidence suggested the recordings had been altered or corrupted by outside interference. Yet the final archive still contained the same disturbing detail in its last frame. The silhouette standing behind the lens, watching the hallway through the camera. The building eventually replaced the entire surveillance system with new equipment. Every camera was upgraded, every cable replaced. The old devices were sealed and stored as evidence of the unexplained anomaly. But according to several technicians involved in the replacement process, the new system experienced its first flicker only 2 nights after installation. At 2:17 a.m., the basement corridor camera recorded a brief distortion lasting less than half a second. When investigators reviewed the frame later that morning, the hallway looked empty. No figure stood beneath the lights. No shadow appeared along the walls. Only one unusual detail existed within the recording. The camera lens reflected something faint in the glass surface, a shape standing just outside the frame, too tall to fit entirely in the reflection, and angled slightly downward, as if something on the other side of the lens was quietly watching whoever might eventually review the footage. No further recordings have been released to the public, but according to several former members of the building's security staff, the cameras still flicker occasionally during the early morning hours. And whenever the distortion appears, it always happens during the exact same moment, the fraction of a second between one frame of recording and the next, as if something unseen is still moving there, waiting inside the space where the camera blinks, and watching anyone who watches it back. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare.